All right. Well, it saddens me to say we are now arriving at Genesis chapter 3, and this is where everything goes upside down, everything goes sideways, everything just gets crazy. So let me share my screen. I know most of us are very familiar with this chapter and just the devastation that is brought to our world and to our personal lives, to our marriages, to our children. But we really need to understand this chapter to understand our world today. So Genesis 3, we're going to look at 1 through 24. Obviously, we're going to do this in a very quick manner, but it's paradise lost, but not forever. And that's really important for us to understand that the man and the woman were in paradise. You couldn't have had a better situation. And when they chose to disobey God and not represent his interests before the world and to represent their own interests, they stopped taking the chaos of the world and bringing divine order, and instead they introduced more chaos. All right, so let's look at the serpent, his strategy, and his goal. What we see is the serpent's strategy, or the serpent introduced in 3:1a. It says, "And now the serpent was more crafty than any beast of the field which the Lord had made." Now we're not told all this, and we don't have time to go through all this, but I do want to briefly touch on the serpent. Clearly is Satan. The serpent is an angel, a fallen angel. The angels, I understand and believe from the book of Job, were created prior to the actual physical creation of our world. They're spiritual beings, and therefore God created them, and they could live within the spiritual realm that God was in. And they watched the physical world be created, is what we see in Job. Within that, then the serpent makes his way into the garden. And at this point, the man should have had his antennas up, right? He's supposed to lead, and in that, he's supposed to protect, and he's supposed to obey the word of God. So as soon as that serpent came in and engaged the woman, because that's what we're going to see, his strategy is in 3:1b through 5, that he actually goes to the woman and he begins to have this conversation with her. And the conversation goes like this. And he said to the woman, the serpent, right, speaking, says, "Indeed, has God said," right? So he's challenging God's authority right there. Has God really said this? Really? I mean, come on. You shall not eat from the tree of the garden. Uh, yes, he said that you should not eat from not any tree of the garden, but one tree in particular, right? And so he is trying to begin to disparage God in the eyes of the woman. And then he, in the next one, it goes on and says, "And the woman said to the serpent, From the fruit of the trees of the garden we may eat." She gets this right, right? And then she goes on and says, "But from the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden," right? That's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. "God has said, You shall not eat from it." And if she had left it there, she would have been fine. But she then adds on, and you see, "and you shall not touch it or you'll die." And so she adds this little extra bit to this whole idea, but adding the extra bit wasn't helpful because she deviated from God's actual plan, and the serpent is already beginning to move her away. He's undermined the authority of God, and now he's going to actually challenge God more directly. And he says this, "And the serpent said to the woman, Surely you will not die." Right? And then it goes on, "For God knows in the day that you eat it, your eyes are going to be open, and that you will be like God, knowing good and evil." Okay, now this is just crazy. When you look at this, first of all, when we look at this, the serpent is definitely trying to cast doubt in the heart of the woman. Secondly, his appeal is that, or his thing is, you're not going to die. Well, God said very clearly, you eat of this fruit, you're going to die. Third is that, when the day you eat it, he's trying to say, look, your eyes are going to be open in a way that you really want, and you'll be like God. Well, why is that a silly thing for him to say? They're made in the image of God. They're already like God. They're not God, but they're like him because they're made in his image, and they are going to both be the image of God, and therefore that's their essence, and they're going to image him, meaning that's what they're going to do. And so he was really appealing to something that she should have immediately recognized. Hey, that we're already that, and I already know the nature of who God is, but she doesn't stop at that point. And so then it says, and well, the other question you have to ask is, where in the world is the man in all this. And he actually seems to be present, as we'll see in verse 6. And this is where the thing goes on. It says, when the woman saw the tree was good for food, right? Is it good for food, the tree? Absolutely, it's good for food because God created it, therefore it's good. It's fruit, and therefore it can be eaten. So he's appealing, though, Satan was appealing to the lust of her flesh. Okay? And then the second thing goes on, it says, and that it was a delight to the eyes, right? Was it a delight to the eyes? I'm sure it was. I'm sure it was a beautiful tree, and that it would have been something beautiful to gaze at. But here he's appealing to the lust of her eyes. And then finally he concludes with, or she concludes with this and says, and it was desirable to make one wise. Okay, and this parallels the idea, look, that God, wisdom is simply taking knowledge and applying it the way God intended. The problem is she is going to take the knowledge and not apply it the way that God intended. And so it's not truly wisdom, but within that, this is the boastful pride of life. So he appeals to her flesh, he appeals to her eyes, and he then appeals to her pride. And as a result, she eats. And when she eats, what does she do next? She gives, it says for this, and she gave to her husband also with her, and he ate. So it would appear that the man was there the entire time. The man was the one who was given this command in Genesis 2:15 through 17. He should have immediately sensed what was going on. He should have stepped in as the authority in that relationship and told Eve that you need to resist what this serpent is saying. He doesn't represent God. He's wrongly representing who God is. He is not representing what God said, and we need to reject him. But he passively sits there and he watches all this unfold, okay? And then what he does is he eats, and that is when the fall takes place. Though she eats first, when we look at Romans 5, you see that it is the man who is held responsible for the fall because of the authority submission relationship. Then what happens immediately, right, is that the man's fall results in him forfeiting dominion because the man was to rule on behalf of God. And I want you to envision it this way. When the man and the woman reject God, they also reject their role as the image of God to image him, verb, to do and to represent his interest. And that authority to rule now the earth is going to be given to the serpent, to Satan. And that is why when you look at Ephesians 2:1 and 2, we see that he is the prince of this world and the authority over this world, and why we have this struggle that we do today. And so at that point, Satan usurps man's dominion. And then it goes on, and we begin to see that in 7 through 19, that the man and the woman immediately become aware of the consequences. And so in verse 7, it says, and their eyes were opened, right? And they saw that they were naked and they felt shame. And so they tried to cover their shame with a fig leaf. And then it's going to have God come through the garden and he's going to expose their sin. And when their sin is exposed, you realize there's a ruptured or a broken relationship between God, who would daily go through with them or walk with them in the garden, but now that relationship has been broken. And then when you get to verses 14 through 19, you have God's judgment. And this judgment is really, really important for us to understand. The serpent will be judged, then the woman will be judged, and then the man will be judged. When the man and the woman are judged, they are judged in light of their ability to fulfill their role as their role and responsibility as images of God. So we'll see that in a minute. So let's begin with understanding the role or the judgment of the serpent. Okay, and so it says this in verse 15, and I'll put, or in verse 14. And the Lord said to the serpent, because you have done this, cursed are you more than every cattle of the earth, and more than every beast of the field, and on your belly you shall go, and you shall eat dust all the day. Okay, this is an idiom at that time, for that you will be humiliated. Okay, that's verse 14. The idea is that God will humiliate you in your great pride that thought you could rule better than God. Then the second thing is in verse 15, and it says, and I will put enmity between the woman and her seed, and you shall be bruised on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. And so what's going to happen here is that you have the seed of the woman. Those are those people who are aligned with God and his interests in the world. And you have the seed of the serpent, those who are opposed to God. And what's going to happen is we're going to have this battle be constantly happen. And you see that from Genesis 3 all the way through Revelation 19. And really, and then it extends into 20 and at the end of the millennial kingdom, and Satan's thrown into the lake of fire. That's when it finally ends. But the reality of what's going on here is that it says that you're going to have this battle between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent, and that the serpent is going to bruise the seed of the woman's head, and that the seed of the woman is going to crush the serpent's head. And what this is it culminates in the cross, right? That when Jesus goes to the cross as the seed of the woman, he is bruised, he dies. Does he stay dead? Absolutely not. He raises from the dead. That's why it's called a bruise. But the head of the serpent is also going to be bruised, but in a fatal manner. That when Jesus died on the cross, he paid for the penalties of the world, but he also defeated Satan. And it's pointing towards a future defeat. So that's the judgment against the serpent. Then the second judgment we're introduced to is against the woman in 3:16, and it says this, and the woman said, excuse me, I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth. In pain, you will bring forth children. And what this is looking at is, it's called, in a technical term, it's called a merism. But what it's looking at is from the time of conception all the way through birth, your ability to fulfill your role as the image of God will be made more difficult, meaning it will be difficult for you to conceive. It will be difficult for you to then have that child, and it will be difficult for you in birth. And we can see that very clearly played out, right? Abraham and Sarah has a hard time getting pregnant. Isaac and Rebecca has a hard time getting pregnant. You have Rachel and Jacob. Rachel has a hard time getting pregnant. And so you just see this over and over. And then eventually Rachel dies when she gives birth to Benjamin. And so we see this Genesis 3 verse 16 just play itself out. So that's the first thing. She's going to have difficulty from conception through birth, which is to be fruitful, multiply, and fill. That's part of her role, is to then be able to do that. That is going to be made more difficult because of the rebellion and because of the fall. Then the second thing is, it says this in verse 16. And let's see, it says, yet, blah, blah, blah. Yes, yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he will rule over you. Okay, well, I mean, that when you on the surface, it just says, okay, your desire is going to be for your husband. Well, that's a good thing, right? But he's going to rule over you. What does that have anything to do with here? All right, we said, first of all, because when we looked at the perfect world before the fall, there was an authority submission relationship within the Trinity that's mirrored in the husband and wife. So that is clear. So when we look at this idea that your desire is going to be for your husband, you have to go to chapter 4, verse 7 of Genesis to really understand that. It says this, if you do well, and this is when God has asked both Cain and Abel then to make their offering, and Cain offers from what he does, which he's a farmer, and God rejects that. Abel offers from what he does, which is an animal sacrifice, which he accepts. He says, look, Cain, you need to remake the offering. And then he says this in verse 7, if you do well, if you obey what I just said and make a new offering, will not your countenance be lifted? Look, you're going to have a change in attitude. Right now, you're just having a bad attitude, right? Because I didn't accept your vegetable offering. And if you do not do well, meaning if you don't redo this offering and offer a proper offering, which is an animal offering, and we'll see why that's important in a minute, sin is crouching at the door. Okay, and then it equates it to a lion, and its desire, the same word that was used in Genesis chapter 3:16, and its desire is for you, but you must master it. So we have this picture of sin crouching at the door. It's just about to take over Cain, and we see that it does overtake Cain, and as a result, he kills his brother Abel. And it's saying, look, the judgment against the woman is that she is going to want to rule over her husband, but he will rule over her. And so this authority submission relationship, she's going to want to flip it. And we see that becomes really important for the nation of Israel to understand as they're going to image God before the world, but it's also equally important for us to understand and to reject how our culture deals with this issue. But with that, we can see that there are two aspects to the woman that made difficult. One is she's going to have problems from conception to birth, and two is she's going to want to rule over her husband, but that flips the divine order. And then we get to the third judgment, and that is against the man in chapter 3, verse 17 through 19. And it says this: Then to Adam he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree that I commanded you, saying you shall not eat from it. And then he's going to give him the curse that follows. Now, when it says that you listen to the voice of your wife, obviously that's not saying don't listen to the voice of your wife, that it's your wife's problem. No, the issue is that you listen to the voice of your wife over the voice of God. See, Adam should have immediately recognized that God had already instructed him how to deal with that garden in the middle, or the tree in the middle of the garden, and that he should have rejected the serpent immediately and protected his wife from that, but he didn't do that. And so as a result, this is the judgments against the man. First judgment is that he's going to have a much more difficult time to rule, and it says it this way: Cursed is the ground because of you, and you will toil to eat of it all the days of your life, right? That man was to take and transform the world outside the garden to become like the world inside the garden. But now that's going to be made a whole lot more difficult. His ability to rule over it and to bring transformation, to bring remember we said that as man feels, he's to bring form. To give it that form is going to be made much more difficult. Then the second thing, it goes on and says, and by the sweat of your face you shall eat your bread, right? That's the idea of it made more difficult. And then it's going to say, until you return to the ground, because from it you were taken, and for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. So man is supposed to work the ground. And what's really interesting here is, remember that man was given this authority over the world and over the dust of the ground. He was taken from the dust of the ground, but he was given this amazing role as the image of God. And the image of God is the apex of creation. But because of his sin, he will then return to he'll lose that place of prominence, and he'll return to the very humble form of dust that he began in. And so you have the judgment against the serpent, you have the judgment against the woman, and you have the judgment against the man. And so for the serpent, he will be defeated by Christ ultimately. For the woman, she is going to have difficulty giving birth. For the man, and she's going to desire to rule over her husband. For the man, he's going to have a difficulty time ruling over the world, and that he is going to forfeit his nobility and become like the dust. And then finally, what we see here, and this is again a fascinating part, is we already introduced the idea of Satan's ultimate defeat. But with that, if you remember back in 3:7, when the man and the woman sinned, they tried to cover themselves with a fig leaf, which is plant life, which is going right along, which we're going to see in the next chapter that Cain tries to do, is to use that a plant life is sufficient to hide their shame and to receive God's forgiveness. But in verse 21, we see that is not the case. And it says this in chapter 3, verse 21, and the Lord God made garments of skin for Adam and his wife and clothed them. Okay, now that's it. What in the world is that all talking about? Well, it's talking about this, is that the garments that the man and the woman tried to make were insufficient to cover their sin, okay, and to get rid of their shame. And so God says, no problem, I will take care of that. But I'm going to give you garments of skin, and those garments of skin are going to require the life of the animal. Aha, and that's the key. That death will give you life. The shedding of blood of the animal is what's going to allow you to be forgiven. He's giving us a beautiful picture of the gospel right there, that the shedding of the Messiah's blood is going to give the world opportunity to have life in and through him. And so this is a very powerful aspect of God and how he's working in the world. Now, with both in 3:21 and in 3:22 through 24, it addresses another issue that's very common with people who don't know God, and that's that, oh man, the God of the Old Testament is really different than the God of the New Testament. The God of the Old Testament is this evil, terrible God. But the God of the New Testament, Jesus, oh, he's just so mamby-pamby, and he's so great and so good. But the reality is the God of the Old Testament is the God of the New Testament. The God of the New Testament is the God of the Old Testament. There is only one God, and he rules over all the earth and through all of history. And that is what we are going to see as we march our way through what God's word says. And what we're introduced in 3:21 and 3:22 and 24 are the grace of God. See, God could have left man in his sinful condition and never said, you know what, there's a way back. But what he was doing is he was demonstrating grace and mercy to say to man that though you are fallen, that I will intervene on your behalf so that you can have a personal relationship with me. And so to do that, though, he has to do another thing, and that's in 22 through 24. And I'm not going to read it, but he removes them from the garden. He actually gets them out of there because within that, there's this thing there's a tree called the tree of life. And had they taken from the tree of life, I believe that they would have been permanently, what would you say? They would be permanently in their fallen state. And what he's trying to do is to say, I don't want that to happen because I have this redemptive plan that's going to unfold. So I'm removing you from the garden. I'm removing you from your ability to take from the tree of life. And then he puts the cherubim in place so they cannot possibly re-enter. And that is how we end chapter 3 and this great rupture in the relationship between the man and God. And so the rest of the Bible from chapter 4 all the way through the end is God wanting to rescue man and bring restoration to man. And that is what we're going to see in the chapters that follow. It's a tough one, but within the fall of man, we see the grace of God. And I hope that that just really thrills your heart because that same God is working in the lives of those who don't know him now. And we could be the very people that introduce them to Christ.